Hi, this is Gautham Sastri here. I'm the CEO of iCentium. I've spent about 30 years uh, in the business of analyzing human communications and deriving actionable intelligence. Uh, so I'm going to start off with something that most of you may not be aware of, uh, which is, how much traffic is happening on the internet. And I'll let if the administrator can see my screen. So this is what's happening right now. Uh, and what I find interesting is the fact that we're literally transmitting about, I'll go to live, 50 trillion bytes per second on the internet. And the real question is, does anybody know what it means? And we've entered an era where we've essentially plugged a piece of our brain into a network of infinite bandwidth and zero latency. So this is a representation of the human condition. You can see that there's 3.7 billion people that are on the internet. You can see the number of websites, the number of Google searches, blog posts, tweets, etc., etc. It's a staggering amount of stuff, and we really don't know how much of this is just stuff, how much is data, how much is content, how much is noise, what does all mean. But if you want to see what everything about Trump is being reflected, here's what's going on. These are all tweets about Trump, and you can see the tweets here. You can see the retweets, and you can also see what was most retweeted over the past hour, or you can see what was most retweeted over the day. And you say, okay, what does this guy, what is he trying to convey? So iCentium essentially has built a system to do wire speed processing of the Twitter firehose while doing natural language analysis. And why is this important? Well, of course, we want to make money. And I can show an example of how you make money by applying natural language processing. And this is the Wells Fargo crisis. So we pretty much detected, let me turn on the signal, we saw this sentiment trend that something bad was happening with Wells Fargo, uh, and we said short it. I mean, there's actually a line there that says short it, while the price was still ticking up. But then, as it became evident that this was a really insidious thing, you can see this ocean of red driving the price down. And it turns out that they fessed up, people got fired, and they got slapped with a relatively minor fine. And then you see things turn green, and you had weeks to buy into Wells Fargo, and this were produced about 36% in returns. The topic of discussion is about artificial intelligence. And the question is, why do you need artificial intelligence? If there are only about 20 tweets a day, you can just read them. But as you can see with this, it's not 20 tweets per day, it's this. The numbers are staggering. So you need a machine that behaves in a humanistic way to make sense of all this stuff, and then figure out what the wisdom of the crowd is in order to achieve outcomes like this. So you don't need artificial intelligence if you didn't have a huge volume of human communication. And it's a double-edged sword, as can be discerned by the fact that you can do good with it, you can do bad with it. So you have some young gentleman that built a system that allows humanity to express itself, and you can see the expression happening. But you also have the same people being dragged in front of Congress and being pilloried for allowing, it's not the Russians are coming, the Russians are here. So the megaphone can be used by messiahs that are agents of good and agents of bad. And so you do need artificial intelligence to not only see what's happening, but who's influencing you? I mean, is this a Russian that's causing this to move in a certain direction, or is this a Chinese intelligence agent trying to affect things in Florida? You know, we don't know because we haven't started looking. And there is a problem with looking, which is if you don't have volume, you don't need AI. So the fact that you have AI means that the problem size is huge. which leads to a certain consequence called operational expenses. And what does that actually mean? It means that you can go bankrupt just trying to look at it. And by way of example, I'll point out that when Snap filed for their IPO, they'd already spent all $3 billion that they raised on Google Cloud and Amazon Web, but they're supposed to be ephemeral. So if you're not actually storing anything, how do you run up a $3 billion storage bill? And the answer is, if you read line number 1 of Snap's patent, it talks about storing. And the problem with storing is that communications happen at wire speed. This is an average of 2 milliseconds of latency, 2 seconds of latency from when somebody said tweet to something showing up on your screen, and it's global. So, the Brits seem to be a bit negative. There's an outlier in Spain. You can, in fact, see that there's tweets coming out of Pakistan, but it's sort of America-centric, but it's a global view. And we actually are running language processing, because if we didn't, you wouldn't have the topic of the hour or the topic of the day writing the headlines. And so I'm not taking sides. I'm making the observation that if you didn't have 50 terabytes per second of internet traffic, you wouldn't need AI. And when you have AI, the cost of running it is sort of like for every dollar that you spend in artificial intelligence, you end up with $10 of operational expense. And that connects to the next thing that I think is going to become very important, which is edge computing, meaning you actually derive insights from your phone and decide which ones to forward for closer examination. And innocent things could be that you determine that 15 to 20-year-old males may be wearing Under Armour t-shirts, and females may be subscribing to some other brand. It may be that there's a song that came out which is becoming a hit because it's becoming very contagious, and so on and so forth. So the topic is, in fact, there is volume. You need AI, and you need to figure out how to set up a system where you don't go out of business because the light bill just became too big. And, you know, this just continues. It's growing at a rate of 38% CAGR. And it's also allowing pernicious things to occur. If you're watching the news, um, we don't know how much child exploitation there is because the next generation of sexting could be, you know, unsavory snapping uh, or whatever. So, Anthony Weiner got thrown into jail for 2.5 years. The subway guy turned out to be a bad dude. And I believe that the solution to extract meaning about what is happening, uh, which is staggering in proportion, is to actually uh, make your phones more intelligent. Because there's no way that anything that's centralized uh, could possibly solve the problem. Anything that's stored is actually an archaeological site. My email is gs@isentium.com. And please feel free to contact me if you have any questions about what I just said. So, on a concluding point, when you look at this and realize that you can just click on it, what you're looking at is something that computes at wire speed, does language analysis, and is a search engine. So we have 200 .live sites, including NHL.live, NFL.live, Gold.live, Watch Russia.live, Watch China.live, Crude.live, Likely.live, Unlikely.live, and so on and so forth, with the premise being there's a huge unaddressed area of exploitation, which is when you Google something, you're told that stuff exists, but it doesn't tell you what it means. And what we've done is essentially Google meets social. And if you want to buy a car, we have a .live site that tells you which cars may suit your demographic. And on a going forward basis, I envision that you say, I want to buy a car, and then you actually have 4 offers for the car that you may like, because all your information is already there. The reality of what's happened is people know where you are, what you're looking at, what you're thinking, because you asked for a voice and platform for expression. And now that you have it, it's going to get monetized because your phones are really low cost because the carriers have to monetize it somehow, and this is one way of monetizing it. And as you can see, it is the wisdom of the crowd that drives the markets, as an example. And the Nobel Prize for Economics was awarded based on the thesis that it is impossible to model economics because humans are fundamentally irrational, but they do drive perceived value. And I really like the guy's answer when he was asked, Professor, what are you going to do with your $1,000,000? And his answer was something totally irrational. So, I'm going to exit stage left by telling you that crazy amounts of expression has happened while I was talking. And nobody really knows what it means. And I encourage those that want to even start understanding to get their shovels out and start digging. Have a great evening. Okay, so I have some questions that showed up. Presumably, you can see it on the screen. Chris asks, I apologize for the clunkiness of my, narrative, but this is something that I haven't done before. So Chris says, how do you eliminate noise from the Twitter feed? Can you take out the bots and automated replies? And I actually wrote the patent for bots. You can look it up on the US Patent Office website. It's owned by Centium, and it is entitled Method and System for Responding to a Plurality of Electronic Messages. So, that's bots. And there's two elements to this. Let's talk about noise. Anybody that's ever been in a trading pit knows it's noisy. But if you hang around for long enough, you start to figure out who's afraid and who's smugly confident. And the trading pit was never quiet. It was always noisy. And those that figured out how to separate noise from signal made a lot of money. And the trading pit is not extinct. It's migrated from speed of sound with a few hundred people to speed of light with a few million people, all of whom can express themselves instantaneously with zero latency. Then you have the really good question about bots and humans. And it's sort of like we invented Ebola, and we're now scrambling to invent the vaccination. And it's a complex problem, but it's something that is, in fact, our number one initiative, especially given the fact that 63% of all pro Trump tweets during the election were bot generated, and about 38% of Hillary's supporting tweets were bot generated. So, uh, and then you extrapolate that into uh, saying we're going to drive greater polarization and divide by seeing the themes that are most volatile and you know having machine generated hysteria. Uh, Having spent 20 years in the intelligence business, what's going on is Trump has a black belt in psychological judo, and he's throwing us around like rag dolls. So we do need to do something about it. Now, Tim asks, what are the drawbacks from social media that work better with the trading pit? And my response to Tim is that, at the end of the day, it's about two things. The trading pit still exists. It's just moved onto the internet. So there's a lot more people engaged in the clamor and wisdom of the crowd. Uh, there's so much sentiment being transmitted that it's actually become like a fluid dynamics problem. I spent some time in the weather business. So it's sort of, if you've been watching TV when hurricanes happen, you see these spaghetti forecasts. And the challenge is to see how many of these things are converging into a uh, conclusion. In other words, in how many ways are you solving the theorem uh, so that you have a higher degree of conviction? And the drawbacks is that you can spread misinformation quite quickly. But if you figure out how to overcome that, then instead of having a 6-month news cycle, which is, by the way, a $50 billion business called research, you can actually reduce it to seconds and minutes and hours and draw greater insights. And when you actually do figure that out, you end up with the scenario where the co-branded index that we launched with JP Morgan made 18% in net returns last year by picking the right 1,400 tweets that predict the direction of the S&P 500 every day. So it's not trivial, but it's about figuring out the correlation between assets, the interactions that occur, and how when people actually, subconsciously start buying stuff or selling stuff, which results in price moves. Thanks everybody for listening, and we live in interesting times. So let's see what happens next. Have a great evening. And by the way, we should salute General Chuck Yeager because 70 years ago he broke the sound barrier. So something meaningful happened on this day.